Villain Warwick was counting the raindrops that fell through his roof. He sat on the only dry patch of floor in his tiny, sagging hovel, a bowl of thin, watery soup cradled in his hands. It was his only meal for the day, probably for tomorrow too. He knew the rules of the town of Greycroft. Rule 1. Mind your own business. The world was hard enough without taking on the burdens of others. Rule 2. Pay your debts. Lord Peaton, who owned every shingle, nail, and sole in the poorer quarters, kept meticulous ledgers. Debt was a stain that never washed out. And especially Rule 3. Never ever trust the things that came from the Whisperwood. The forest was ancient, full of monsters and forgotten things. But when he went to the edge of the woods, scavenging for fallen branches to burn, he found her. An orc. She was caught in a hunter's iron-toothed trap, the metal jaws buried deep in her muscular green calf. She was bleeding, shivering, and desperate. He broke the most important rule of all. And that choice changed everything. The air was thick with the smell of rain on dust and the coppery tang of blood. Villain stood frozen for a long moment, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Everything he had ever been taught screamed at him to run. Orcs were monsters, killers, savages who served bloodthirsty warlords in the north. The stories told to frightened children were full of them, with their sharp tusks and brutal strength. This one was huge, even slumped against the ancient oak. Her shoulders were broader than his doorway, her arms thick with corded muscle. But then her head lifted. Her eyes, the color of dark amber, met his, and he didn't see a monster. He saw pain. He saw exhaustion so deep it seemed carved into the lines of her face. He saw fear, the same fear he felt every time he heard Lord Peaton's heavy boots on the cobblestones. The fear of being trapped with no way out. He took a hesitant step forward. The orc flinched, a low growl rumbling in her chest. Her hand went to a wicked-looking blade at her hip, but the movement sent a fresh wave of agony through her, and she gasped, her knuckles white. I won't hurt you, Villain said, his voice barely a whisper. It sounded thin and foolish in the oppressive silence of the woods. She watched him, her gaze sharp and intelligent. She was assessing him, weighing his every move. He was small, thin, his clothes little more than patched rags. He held no weapon. He was clearly no threat to a warrior, even a wounded one. Villain swallowed the lump of fear in his throat. He thought of the soup in his cottage. He thought of his own gnawing hunger. Then he looked at the blood pooling on the damp earth around the trap. He couldn't just walk away. His fatal strength, his mother had called it, an inability to see suffering and do nothing. It was a curse in a world that rewarded callousness. He knelt, his knees sinking into the mud. "The trap," he said, pointing. "I can try to open it." The orc said nothing, but her eyes never left his face. The growl subsided. It was permission, or maybe just resignation. The mechanism was old and rusted. It took all of Villain's meager strength to get any purchase on the release lever. He grunted, his muscles straining. His hands were slick with rain and mud. The orc watched him, her breathing ragged. He could feel the heat coming off her skin. He could smell the scent of pine needles, leather, and something else, something wild and deeply alive. Finally, with a pained groan from the metal and a sharp cry from the orc, the jaws sprang open. She collapsed fully against the tree, her wounded leg outstretched. The gash was deep and horrific. It needed cleaning. It needed binding. "Can you stand?" Villain asked. She tried, pushing herself up with a grunt, but her leg gave way immediately, and she fell back with a curse that was all sharp consonants. Villain looked back toward the flickering lights of Greycroft. He couldn't leave her here. Wolves or worse, the hunter who set the trap would find her. He thought of his leaking roof, his empty larder, the debt that hung over his head like a guillotine. Bringing her home was madness. It was suicide. He did it anyway. Getting her back to the hovel was a nightmare. She leaned on him, a staggering weight that made his bones ache. Every step was a trial. She was trying to bear her own weight. He could tell. Her muscles bunched with effort, but the pain was too much. By the time they reached his crooked door, they were both gasping for breath, soaked to the bone. He helped her inside, into the small, dim space that was his entire world. The room was dominated by a single cot, a rickety table, and a cold hearth. The air smelled of damp and poverty. She looked around, her amber eyes taking in the pathetic scene. He saw a flicker of something in her gaze. Not pity, something closer to understanding. "Here," he said, guiding her to the cot. It was the only soft thing he owned. She sank onto it, her face pale beneath its green hue. Villain moved on autopilot, his mind numb with the enormity of what he'd done. He found his last clean rags and a bucket of rainwater. He gently, hesitantly, began to clean the wound. She hissed as the cold water touched the raw flesh. But she didn't pull away. She just watched him, her expression unreadable. He wrapped the leg as best he could. The bleeding slowed. He stood up, feeling a wave of dizziness from the exertion and the lack of food. His eyes fell on the bowl of soup still sitting on the table. It was pathetic. A few slivers of turnip and a wilted carrot in cloudy water. But it was all he had. He took the bowl, found his only other spoon, a dented tin thing, and held it out to her. She stared at the bowl, then at him. A complex emotion played across her face. "You are starving," she said. Her voice was a low, gravelly rumble, the first words she'd spoken to him. "So are you," Villain replied simply. She hesitated, then took the bowl. Her large, scarred hands dwarfed the small wooden vessel. She ate slowly, deliberately, as if memorizing the taste of each spoonful. When she was finished, she held the empty bowl for a moment before handing it back. "My name is Kaza," she said. "Violin." Silence fell between them, but it was different now. It wasn't the silence of fear and suspicion. It was the silence of two outcasts, huddled together in a crumbling shack, sharing a moment of respite from a world that had no place for either of them. Villain stoked the embers in the hearth, adding a few of the precious branches he'd gathered. A tiny flame flickered to life, casting dancing shadows on the walls. In the dim, wavering light, Villain saw the glint of something at Kaza's throat. A heavy iron lock, hanging from a leather cord. It was ornate, ancient. He found his own hand going to his pocket, his fingers closing around the familiar shape of the rusty iron key he always carried. It was his father's, the only thing he had left of his parents. It didn't open anything he knew of, but it was his. A piece of a life that was gone. Kaza's eyes followed the movement. She saw the key as he drew it partly from his pocket. Her gaze lingered on it for a second, a flicker of curiosity in her amber eyes, before she looked away, her expression shuttered once more. He put the key back. He was a fool, a complete and utter fool. He had brought a monster into his home. He had given her his last meal. He had broken every rule. And as he sat on the cold, damp floor, listening to the rain and the quiet, pained breathing of the orc on his cot, he felt a strange sense of peace. He had made a choice, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like his own. If you believe that kindness matters more than species, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps us share more stories about unlikely heroes. Now, back to Villain's decision, because things were about to get dangerous. The next few days passed in a tense, quiet rhythm, a coexistence of desperation. Villain would leave at dawn to search for day labor at the docks or in the market, any small coin he could earn to buy a heel of bread or a handful of wilted vegetables. He would return at dusk, exhausted and often empty-handed, to find Kaza still on his cot. Her leg was healing, but slowly. The deep green of her skin was bruised and swollen around the gash. She was a warrior, used to action and movement, and the forced stillness was a visible torment. She would watch him with those intense amber eyes, a storm of frustration and gratitude warring within her. "This is not right," she rumbled one evening, as Villain divided a small stale loaf of bread into two equal halves. His own stomach was a hollow, aching pit. "It's all I could get," he said, misinterpreting her. "No," she insisted, pushing her half back toward him. "I am the warrior. I should provide. I should protect. Instead, I lie here, a burden. I eat your food. I sleep in your bed. It's just a cot," Villain said with a weak smile, "and you needed it more than I did." Her jaw tightened. Honor was etched into her bones as deeply as her scars. This helplessness was a poison to her. The next day, when Villain returned, he found the room changed. Kaza had dragged herself from the cot. Using the leg of the rickety table for support, she had tidied the small space. The rags were folded, the floor was swept clean of debris, and on the table sat a small pile of dark, pungent herbs. "What's this?" Villain asked, surprised. "A poultice," she said, gesturing to her leg. "My people use it. It draws out infection and speeds healing. I found the plants near the woods. I did not go far." He could see the effort it had cost her. Sweat beaded on her brow, but there was a spark of pride in her eyes. She had contributed. She was not useless. Their domestic struggle became a strange partnership. Kaza, with her knowledge of the wilds, taught Villain which roots were edible, which barks could be brewed into a tea to soothe his persistent cough. Villain, in turn, showed her how to mend his torn shirt with a needle and thread, a delicate task that her large, powerful hands found maddeningly difficult. One afternoon, Villain came home to a thunderous crash. He burst through the door to find Kaza in the middle of the room, covered in dust and bits of thatch, a large hole now gaping in the ceiling where a small leak had once been. She'd been trying to fix the roof from the inside. "I saw the weak spot," she grumbled, looking at the mess with disgust. "I thought I could reinforce it." Villain looked at the hole, then at her mortified face, and he started to laugh. It was a weak, wheezing sound at first, born of exhaustion and hunger, but it grew into a genuine, helpless laugh. Kaza stared at him, bewildered, then a slow smile spread across her face, showing the edges of her tusks. A low chuckle rumbled in her chest. In that moment, surrounded by the evidence of their shared poverty and her failed attempt at home repair, the wall of prejudice between them crumbled into dust. They were not human and orc, they were just Villain and Kaza, two people trying to hold a crumbling world together. But their fragile peace was not meant to last. Greycroft had eyes and ears. Whispers had already started. Villain Warwick was buying more food than one man could eat. He was seen at the edge of the Whisperwood. He kept to himself more than usual. The discovery came in the form of a child's lost ball. It rolled down the muddy alley and bumped against Villain's door. A small boy, no older than 7, chased after it. He pushed the door, which was never locked, and peered inside, just as Kaza was moving from the cot to the table. The boy's eyes went wide. A silent, terrified oath formed on his lips. He didn't even scream. He just turned and ran, his feet pounding a frantic retreat on the cobblestones. Villain, returning from a fruitless search for work, saw the boy fleeing and knew, with a sinking dread, that their time was up. It didn't take long. That evening, a knock came at the door. Not a friendly rap, but a heavy, authoritative thud. Villain opened it to find 2 of the town's thuggish watchmen. Behind them stood Lord Piton. Piton was a man who seemed perpetually dry, even in the damp air of Greycroft. His face was pinched, his lips a thin, bloodless line. He dressed in severe black, a large leather-bound ledger tucked under one arm like a holy text. His eyes, small and grey like river stones, flickered past Villain and into the dim room, immediately landing on Kaza. A flicker of distaste, quickly masked by avarice, crossed his features. "Warwick," he said, his voice as crisp and dry as old parchment. "It seems you have a guest." "She's a friend," Velin stammered, his body instinctively shielding the doorway. "A friend?" Peaton's thin lips curled into a semblance of a smile. It did not reach his eyes. "The town charter is very specific about harboring non-human entities. It carries a rather steep fine. A fine, I might add, to be placed atop your already considerable ancestral debt." Debt. The word hung in the air, cold and heavy. Velin's father had owed Peaton's father. His grandfather had owed Peaton's grandfather. The debt was an inheritance, a chain passed down through generations, growing heavier with each passing year. "I have violated no law," Kazar's voice rumbled from inside. She stood, leaning on the table, her presence filling the small hovel. She was an imposing figure, and the watchman shifted nervously. "That is for me to decide," Peaton said coolly, his gaze not even gracing her. He looked only at Velin, the master of the debt. The child who saw her was hysterical, frightened the market into a panic. "Panics are bad for business, Warwick. They disrupt the flow of coin." "She has done nothing wrong," Velin insisted, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. "She was hurt. I helped her." Peaton sighed, a sound of theatrical weariness. He opened his ledger. "Let's see. Velin Warwick. Debt inherited, 300 gold crowns. Interest accrued over 20 years, 450 crowns. Current balance, 750 crowns. An insurmountable sum for a man of your means." He tapped a long, pale finger on the page. "I have been lenient. I have allowed you to live in this property, out of respect for your family's long history of servitude." He snapped the ledger shut. "My leniency is at an end. You have brought a monster into my town. You have violated the charter. You have frightened the populace. I want the creature gone by sunrise, and I want a payment of 50 crowns against your debt by week's end as a gesture of your good faith." 50 crowns. Velin hadn't seen 50 crowns in his entire life. It was an impossible sum. It was a death sentence. "And if I can't pay?" Velin asked, his voice hollow. Peaton's smile returned, colder than ever. "Then the debt will be settled in the traditional manner. The hovel will be forfeit, and you will enter indentured servitude at my quarries. The term should be, about 40 years. Give or take." He glanced at Kazar. "And the beast will be put down as a public menace." He turned to leave, his black coat swirling around him. "Sunrise, Warwick. The beast is gone. 1 week, 50 crowns." The watchman gave Kazar one last nervous look before following their master. The door swung shut, leaving Velin and Kazar in a silence more profound than any they had yet shared. The dampness of poverty felt like it was finally seeping into Velin's bones, a chilling mold that would consume him. He sank onto the floor, the last of his strength gone. He had tried to do one good thing, one single, decent thing, and it had brought utter ruin. He had not only condemned himself, but Kazar as well. He felt a heavy hand on his shoulder. He looked up into Kazar's amber eyes. There was no judgment in them, only a fierce, burning loyalty. "You did not bring ruin, Velin Warwick," she said, her voice a low, steady anchor in the storm of his despair. "You brought me shelter. You showed me honor when my own people had none. This debt, this man, they are the monsters here. Not you, not me." She squeezed his shoulder, her grip firm and reassuring. "We are a clan of two," she said, the words echoing with an ancient weight. "A clan does not surrender." That night, they didn't speak of Peaton's threat. Instead, Kazar spoke of her home. She told him of the Frostback Mountains, of a sky so wide and blue it hurt to look at. She spoke of her clan, the Stone Tusk, and their code of honor. An honor that had been betrayed by their new warlord, a brute named Thrathrak Skull Render. Thrathrak valued power over honor, tribute over tradition. He had allied himself with human slavers, trading captured rivals for weapons and gold. Kaza had spoken out against him. For her defiance, she was branded a traitor and sentenced to death. She had fought her way free, but not before taking a poisoned blade to the side. She had been fleeing for weeks, the poison slowly sapping her strength. When she stumbled into the hunter's trap, "You are a deserter," Velin said softly, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. "I did not desert my people," she corrected him fiercely. "I deserted a tyrant. There is a difference." As she spoke, Velin felt the fragile seed of trust between them grow into something deeper, something stronger. A bond forged not in magic, but in shared hardship and mutual respect. He was an outcast in his own town, chained by a debt he did not incur. She was an exile from her own people, hunted for an honor she would not abandon. They were both trapped. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the rusty key. He turned it over and over in his palm, the cold iron a familiar comfort. "My father gave me this," he said quietly. "He said it was the key to our future, that it represented a promise. He died in Peyton's quarries before he could tell me what it meant." Kaza looked at the key, her gaze intense. She reached for the iron lock at her neck, her fingers tracing its intricate patterns. For a moment, a strange, unspoken question hung in the air between them. But the moment passed. The world outside, with its debts and its monsters, was still waiting. The week passed in a blur of mounting dread. Velin worked himself to the bone, taking the most back-breaking, degrading jobs for a few copper pieces. He cleaned fish guts from the docks, hauled stone for the masons, mucked out stables. At night, he would return with blistered hands and an aching back, and they would count his meager earnings. It was never enough. It would never be enough. Kaza, meanwhile, was growing stronger. The poultice and her incredible constitution were knitting the flesh of her leg back together. She began to move around the hovel with a warrior's deadly grace, her limp barely noticeable. She insisted Velin eat the lion's share of their food. "You work, I heal. When I am healed, I will hunt. For now, you must have strength," she insisted. The day of the deadline arrived with a cold, grey dawn. They had gathered a pitiful sum, 4 silver crowns and a handful of copper. Not even a tenth of what Peyton demanded. There was no hope. Velin sat at the table, staring at the small pile of coins. Despair was a physical weight, pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. He had failed. "It's over," he whispered. "He'll come today. He'll take me to the quarries. And he'll kill you." Kaza stood by the small, grimy window, looking out at the town that despised her. Her hand rested on the hilt of her blade. "Let him come," she said, her voice a low growl. "I will not die like a beast in a cage." "You can't fight the whole town watch," Velin pleaded. "You'll be killed. And for what? For me?" "I will not fight the town," she said, turning to face him. Her amber eyes were blazing. "I will fight for my clan. For our clan. The clan of 2. Before Velin could reply, a horn blast echoed through the town. It was not the sound of the town watch. It was deeper, more guttural. A war horn. Shouts and screams erupted from the market square. Panic. Kaza's face went rigid. A look of grim recognition dawned in her eyes. "Thrathrak," she breathed. The door to the hovel burst open. It was not Lord Peyton. It was a hulking orc in black iron armor, his face a mask of brutal scars. Behind him stood more orcs, their weapons drawn, and at their center, a monster of a creature, even larger than the rest, with a helmet forged into the shape of a screaming skull. Thrathrak's skull render had found her. At the same time, from the other end of the alley, Lord Peyton appeared, flanked by his 2 guards. He had his ledger in hand, a smug look of triumph on his face. He was coming to collect his debt. The 2 groups froze, spotting each other at the same instant. Thrathrak's forces, a vision of raw, violent power. Piton's group, the embodiment of cold, bureaucratic cruelty. And caught between them, in the doorway of a crumbling shack, were Vilen and Kaza. The crisis had arrived, not as one storm, but two, colliding directly over their heads. Thrathrak's skull-render's eyes, burning coals in the shadow of his helmet, ignored Piton completely. They fixed on Kaza with a venomous hatred. "Deserter," he snarled, the word echoing down the narrow alley. "I've hunted you across half the kingdom. Did you think you could hide in this human filth hole forever?" Lord Piton, momentarily taken aback by the arrival of a small Orcish warband, quickly regained his composure. This was his town, his ledger, his rules. "I am Lord Piton of Greycroft," he announced, his voice sharp and imperious. "This is a lawful collection of a debt. That creature," he pointed a contemptuous finger at Kaza, "is forfeit to me, as is the man." Thrathrak let out a short, brutal laugh. "The she-orc is mine, little man. She bears the traitor's brand. Her life belongs to me." He took a heavy step forward, his warriors fanning out behind him. The air grew thick with the threat of imminent violence. Piton's guards took a nervous step back. They were bullies, used to intimidating starving peasants, not facing down armored orc warriors. But Piton's arrogance was absolute. "This town operates under the king's law. Your northern squabbles mean nothing here. Now stand aside, or I will have you all arrested for obstructing—" He never finished the sentence. With a snarl, Thrathrak's second-in-command backhanded one of Piton's guards, sending him sprawling into a pile of refuse. The other guard dropped his spear and ran. Piton stood alone, his face a comical mask of shock and outrage. His ledger, his symbol of power, suddenly seemed like a very flimsy shield. "Now!" Thrathrak boomed, turning his attention back to Kaza. "There is nowhere left to run." And then, the impossible happened. Vilen, the small, weak, starving human, stepped out of the doorway and placed himself directly between Kaza and the warlord. His body was trembling, but his stance was defiant. "No," Vilen said, his voice shaking but clear. "You will not touch her." Thrathrak stared down at him, a look of genuine disbelief on his scarred face. You would protect this honorless coward?" He gestured at Vilen's ragged clothes and thin frame. "You are a twig. I could snap you with one hand." "Maybe," Vilen agreed, his hand finding the rusty key in his pocket, the familiar shape grounding him. "But she is not a coward, and she is not honorless. I know what honor is. It's feeding someone when you are starving. It's protecting someone who is hurt. It's keeping a promise." His eyes flickered toward Piton, who was watching with a mixture of fear and fury. "Something men like you, whether you carry a sword or a book of debts, know nothing about." It was a speech born of desperation and a pure, unshakable conviction. It was the voice of the weak standing up to the strong, a protest against the cruelty of the world. In the sudden silence, the townspeople, who had been peering from windows and doorways, began to creep closer. They had come to see a monster evicted. They were now witnessing something far more compelling. Kaza stepped up beside Vilen, placing a hand on his shoulder. The gesture was protective, a declaration of alliance. "He is right, Thrathrak," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound strength. "You speak of honor, but you ally with Slavers. You speak of tradition, but you sell our people for steel. You are the traitor to the Stone Tusk clan. I did not desert our people. I defied you." A murmur went through the small crowd. They had only ever seen orcs as a monolithic, monstrous force. The idea of politics, of honor and betrayal among them, was a revelation. Thrathrak's face contorted with rage. "Words! The last refuge of the weak! Your life is forfeit!" He raised his massive, rune-etched axe. "Wait." Kaza's voice cut through the tension. Her gaze was locked not on Thrathrak, but on the rusty key that Vilen was now clutching in his open palm. A strange light of dawning comprehension filled her eyes. "The key," she said, her voice hushed with awe. "Let me see the key." Velan, confused, held it out. Kaza reached up and pulled the heavy iron lock from her neck. She held it next to the key. The crowd gasped. The key's intricate, rusted bit was a perfect match for the lock's complex mechanism. The swirling patterns on the key's bow mirrored the engravings on the lock's face. They were a set. "What is this?" Thrathrak demanded, his attack momentarily forgotten. "This," Kaza said, her voice swelling with power and history, "is the lock of the first accord. And that," she pointed to the key in Velan's hand, "is the Founder's key." Lord Peaton, who had been forgotten in the exchange, let out a choked sound. "Nonsense. Superstitious ramblings." "Is it?" Kaza challenged, her amber eyes burning into him. "The story of Greycroft's founding is a lie. A human lie, told to erase your partners. This town was not founded by your ancestor alone, debt keeper. It was founded by a human, Bramwell Warwick, and an orc chieftain, Gauza Stone Tusk. They forged a pact, a promise of shared land and mutual protection. A first accord," she turned to the stunned crowd. "They sealed their pact with two objects. A lock, passed down through the Stone Tusk chieftains, and a key, passed down through the Warwick line. The accord itself, the original charter of this town, was placed in a stone coffer, hidden for safekeeping, to be opened only if the pact was ever broken." Velan stared at the key in his hand, then at his own name. Warwick, Bramwell Warwick. The name was carved on the oldest gravestone in the town cemetery, his ancestor. The key wasn't a sentimental trinket. It was a legacy, a truth. "Lies!" Peaton shrieked, his composure finally shattering. "My family has held the charter for 5 generations. The debt is legal. The land is mine." "Your charter is a forgery," Kaza declared. "A lie you built your fortune on. The real charter grants the Warwick line ownership of their ancestral home, free and clear, and grants my people rights to the Whisperwood. Your ancestral debt is a fraud." She took the key from Velan's numb fingers. The metal seemed to hum in her grasp. She held the key and lock up for all to see. The coffer was hidden beneath the Founder's hearth. The oldest hearth in Greycroft, the hearth in this very house. Can you believe they did that? If you're rooting for this strange family to survive, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Comment below. Would you have opened your door? But hold on, because Thrathrak wasn't finished yet. The revelation hung in the air, electric and shattering. The entire history of Greycroft, the foundation of its social order and Lord Peaton's power, was a lie. The crowd of townspeople stared, their faces a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and dawning anger. They looked from the key and lock to Peaton's pale, sweating face, and then to Velan's crumbling hovel. The Founder's hearth. Thrathrak was the first to recover. He cared nothing for human charters or ancient pacts. He saw only a challenge to his authority. "Trinkets and tales," he roared, his voice thick with contempt. "You think this saves you, deserter? You shame our people with human myths? I bring honor to our people by revealing the truth," Kaza retorted, her voice ringing with conviction. She looked at Velan. "The hearthstone. We have to lift it." But Thrathrak was done with words. With a bellow of pure rage, he charged, his massive axe swinging in a deadly arc aimed at Kaza's head. She met his charge not with fear, but with a warrior spirit rekindled. She shoved Velan back into the safety of the doorway and drew her own blade. The clash of steel on steel screamed through the alley. It was a dance of death between two masters of combat. Thrathrak was a hurricane of brute force, his axe blows powerful enough to shatter stone. But Kaza, now fighting for her home, for her friend, for her rediscovered honor, was a flash of lightning. She was faster, more agile, her movements economical and precise. She parried his wild swings, her blade a blur, turning his own momentum against him. While the life or death struggle raged, a new drama unfolded. The townspeople, their shock turning to outrage, surged forward. Not towards the dueling orcs, but towards Lord Peton. "A fraud," yelled the blacksmith, a burly man whose own family had been paying Peton for generations. "My grandfather lost his forge over a debt to your father." "He took my family's farm," cried a woman from the crowd. "He said the charter gave him the right." Peton, his face ashen, backed away, holding his precious ledger like a shield. "These are the ravings of a savage. I am your lord. I protect you. You protect your coin purse." The blacksmith boomed, and he snatched the ledger from Peton's grasp. He opened it, and though he couldn't read the fine script, the endless columns of names and numbers were a clear testament to generations of exploitation. With a roar of communal fury, he ripped the book in half, the pages scattering like dead leaves in the wind. Peton let out a strangled cry, as if the blacksmith had torn out his own heart. His power, stripped of its paper-thin authority, vanished. He was just a man, a greedy, frightened man, surrounded by a mob of people he had systematically ruined. Meanwhile, Velen, his mind reeling, scrambled back inside the hovel. The hearth. It had to be the hearth. He fell to his knees before the simple stone fireplace, his fingers searching for a seam, a crack, anything. The large flat stone at the base seemed solid. He pushed, he pulled, but it wouldn't budge. Outside, the duel reached its climax. Kaza, using her smaller size to her advantage, ducked under a sweeping blow from Thrathrak's axe and drove the pommel of her sword into his knee. The warlord roared in pain and stumbled. It was the opening she needed. She spun, her blade whistling through the air, and sliced the leather straps holding his skull-faced helmet in place. The helmet clattered to the cobblestones. For the first time, the crowd saw Thrathrak's face. It was not the face of an indomitable demon king. It was the face of a scarred, hate-filled bully, his eyes wide with surprise and a flicker of fear. Seeing him without his mask of terror broke his mystique. His own warriors hesitated, their belief in his invincibility shaken. "You lead through fear, not strength," Kaza panted, her blade held ready. "Your reign is over, Thrathrak. The Stone Tusk clan will be free of your poison." Inside, Velen felt a surge of adrenaline. He saw a small, almost invisible notch on the side of the hearthstone. It was shaped like the tip of a key. With trembling hands, he took the Founder's key, the rusty piece of iron that had been his only connection to a forgotten past, and inserted the tip into the notch. It was a perfect fit. He used it as a lever. With a deep, grinding sound of stone on stone, the heavy hearthstone shifted. Velen threw his entire weight into it, and the slab scraped aside, revealing a dark, hollow cavity beneath. There, nestled on a bed of dry, rotted cloth, was an iron coffer, sealed and ancient. At that exact moment, Thrathrak, driven to a final desperate fury, lunged at Kaza. But his charge was clumsy, his balance compromised. Kaza sidestepped with fluid grace, her foot lashing out to trip him. The massive warlord, his own momentum his undoing, crashed headlong into the wall of the hovel, his head striking the stone with a sickening crack. He slid to the ground, unconscious and defeated. Silence. The fight was over. Thrathrak's warriors, their leader fallen and their purpose lost, looked at Kaza, who stood tall and victorious. There was no fear in their eyes now. There was respect. Velen emerged from the hovel, dragging the heavy iron coffer behind him. He was covered in soot and sweat, but his eyes shone with a triumphant light. He set the box down in the middle of the alley. All eyes turned to it. Kaza knelt. She took the lock of the first accord from her neck. It was not a piece of jewelry, but the lock to this very box. She fitted it into place. Then she took the Founder's key from Velen. She slid it into the lock. With a resonant metallic click that echoed through the silent crowd, the lock sprang open. The climax was not a clash of swords, but the turning of a key. Kaza lifted the heavy lid. Inside, resting on faded velvet, was a scroll of parchment, its ink still dark and clear, sealed with two ribbons, one the color of dried blood, the other the color of the forest. Wieland unrolled it. The town's old scholar, a man Peyton had long dismissed, pushed his way to the front. He peered at the document, his eyes wide. "It's the old tongue," he breathed. "And the Orcish runes. I can read it." He began to translate, his voice growing stronger with every word. It spoke of a pact of equals. It named Bramwell Warwick and Gorza Stone Tusk as founders. It decreed that the Warwick house and the land it stood on would belong to his line forever, free of tax or debt. It granted the Stone Tusk clan stewardship of the Whisperwood, with rights to hunt and forage, in exchange for their protection of the town from greater threats. It was the truth, the undeniable, history-shattering truth. Lord Peyton let out a pathetic whimper. His entire world, his fortune, his identity, was built on a lie that had just been unlocked by a rusty key. Wieland looked at the crowd. He looked at Kaza, her face proud and vindicated. He looked at the defeated form of Thrathrak and the disgraced figure of Peyton. The weak had stood for the strong. The hidden value of a worthless trinket and a forgotten history had been revealed. The debt was not paid. It was erased. It had never existed at all. The resolution was not immediate, nor was it simple. It began with the slow, hesitant rebuilding of a broken world. Thrathrak's warriors, leaderless and shamed, offered their fealty to Kaza. She accepted not as a warlord, but as a chieftain who would lead them back to the true honor of the Stone Tusk clan. She pronounced judgment on Thrathrak. Not death, but exile. He was stripped of his armor and weapons and sent into the wilds, his power broken, his name a curse. He would be a ghost, a reminder of what happened when honor was abandoned for greed. Lord Peyton faced a different kind of justice. The townspeople, their anger now a cold, hard thing, did not tear him apart. Instead, led by the blacksmith and the old scholar, they brought him before a hastily assembled town council. The true charter, the first accord, was read aloud for all to hear. Peyton's fraudulent ledgers were brought forth as evidence of his crimes. He was stripped of his title, his lands, and his ill-gotten wealth. The property he owned was redistributed among the families he had ruined. He was sentenced to work, for the first time in his life, rebuilding the very community he had bled dry. His debt to society was real, and it would take a lifetime to repay. For Wieland and Kaza, the changes were more personal. The first thing they did was fix the roof. The town's carpenter, a man who had once sneered at Wieland's poverty, showed up the next morning with a team of helpers, a cart full of fresh timber and thatch, and a look of profound respect on his face. "The founder's house should not have a leaky roof," he said gruffly, and set to work. Others came too. The baker's wife brought a basket filled with warm bread, savory pies, and sweet buns. It was more food than Wieland had seen in a year. The farmer whose land had been returned brought sacks of potatoes and carrots. People who had once crossed the street to avoid Wieland now approached him with quiet thanks, with offerings, with apologies. He was no longer Wieland, the debtor, the outcast. He was Wieland Warwick, the founder's kin. Kaza, too, found her place transformed. She was not the monster in the shadows, but Chieftain Kaza of the Stone Tusk, co-steward of Greycroft. Children who had once run in fear now approached her with wide-eyed curiosity. One small girl, the same one whose lost ball had started it all, timidly offered her a wildflower. Kaza accepted it with a solemn nod, her large scarred hand gentle as she tucked it behind her ear. A new community began to form, slowly and awkwardly at first. Orcs from Kaza's clan came down from the Whisperwood not as raiders, but as traders and partners. They brought rare herbs, sturdy lumber, and knowledge of the forest. In return, the townspeople offered crafted goods, woven cloth, and the blacksmith's fine steel. The wall of prejudice that had stood for generations began to crumble, brick by painful brick. It wasn't perfect. There were still arguments, moments of mistrust, and the difficult work of unlearning a lifetime of hate. But it was a start, a hopeful start. The hovel, now repaired and weatherproof, began to feel like a home. The larder was never empty. The hearth was always warm. Vilain and Kaza would sit at the small table in the evenings, sharing a proper meal. The silence between them now comfortable and easy. It was the silence of family. One evening, Kaza placed the founder's key and the lock of the first accord on the table between them. The key was no longer rusty. Vilain had painstakingly polished it until the iron gleamed. The lock was no longer a sign of a hidden burden, but a symbol of a revealed truth. "My place is with my clan, in the mountains," Kaza said softly, her gaze on the fire. "I must lead them. Rebuild what Thrathrak broke." Vilain's heart clenched. He had known this was coming, but the thought of her leaving left an emptiness in the room that no amount of food or fire could fill. "Greycroft needs you too," he said quietly. "I need you." Kaza looked at him, and for the first time, he saw a vulnerability in her amber eyes that matched his own. A chieftain cannot rule from a human town. "Then the clan of two is over?" he asked, his voice small. A slow smile spread across her face. "Clans merge, they grow. The Stone Tusk clan needs a link to Greycroft, an emissary, someone who understands both worlds." She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "And I need a home to come back to, a hearth to warm myself by, a friend to share a meal with." The choice was unspoken, but clear. She would lead her people, but this house, this life they had built from the ruins of their old ones, would be her anchor, and he would be the bridge between the town and the woods, a founder in his own right. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers with hers. Her grip was strong and warm. Outside, the sounds of Greycroft were different. There was laughter mixed with the merchants' calls. The guttural sounds of Orcish speech mingled with the common tongue. It was the sound of a future being built. Different didn't mean enemy. Family was a choice, not blood. And sometimes, a broken man in a broken house could find the key to fixing the whole world. And that is how a poor human and an exiled Orc chieftain proved that family is a choice, not blood. If this story touched your heart, please smash that like button. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories about compassion overcoming fear. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that even a rusty key can open a future. Thanks for watching.